Well, good morning, Trinity friends, and welcome to our third and final installment of our wonderful series with Dr. Elizabeth Colton, discussing public diplomacy and everyday toolbox for the church and you. As you all know by now, Liz is a wonderful, storied member of Trinity Episcopal Church, a lifelong member, even when she was roaming around the world in her various pursuits, always a member of Trinity. Now a vestry member. She's been a diplomat, a journalist, and now is an educator, and she's consistently educating us here at Trinity. So Liz, thank you so much for all the time that you've taken with us, all the ways that you've shared your wisdom. And today you're going to be in conversation with me.
Right. Thank you so much, David. This is really, for me, it's been a very exciting series in our adult, but I also hope that the youth realize it's also for everybody in the church and the world. But it's not just for adults, it's for youth as well. What I've been talking about, we've been talking about our first session, we introduced the concepts of diplomacy and public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy and the idea that everybody could be a diplomat, meaning a citizen diplomat, and working for good in the world. And I always like to think of it as working for peace in the world. So in the beginning, we talked about the tools and techniques, and they're traditional tools that we've discussed, like speeches and holding conferences and sending out missions and trade teams and using broadcast media and print media, working with the media. Those are the traditional tools. And last week, we had a marvelous session in which I got to discuss with our rector, the Reverend Dr. Scott White, to talk about his relationship to his sermons, which is a sermon is a speech, and how the whole process of writing those sermons. Today, I'm going to be talking with our associate rector, Reverend David Henson, Reverend David Henson here, and talking about the role of the new media, the new tools, which are digital, and that includes social media. And so I'd like to talk with David, who himself, like me, was a journalist before he went into the priesthood. So David, I'd like to talk to you. Let me start by asking you, when did you start thinking about the digital tools as a main tool for use in the church, for example, or your whole idea about that, and then we can step forward?
So for me, because I'm just a hair under 40 right now, kind of the whole digital language for me is kind of a backdrop of my entire life. So for me, the digital world is very much an extension of the quote unquote real world. And so it's never been a question of whether we use it as a church, but how can we best implement it as a church? My generation and the generations coming after me, we have lived a significant portion of our times online. And so our physical world and our digital worlds are very much overlapping spheres to both good and ill consequences, quite frankly. And we can talk about some of those later. But for me, looking at a church, it's a fantastic way to be able to communicate first with your own people. You think about the percentages of people who are using social media across all age demographics, and I think you have the ability to reach into the palm of somebody's hand with your message is really powerful, to be able to hit them there. And then also to realize that if you do it well, that message can then be amplified much more broadly in your community and throughout the nation, depending on kind of what your goals are. So for me, having the church as a faithful witness within the digital public sphere is really important, because there's a lot of witnesses that aren't so faithful in the digital public sphere. And so I feel like that's part of our incarnational role almost, because that's where people are and that's where they're spending a lot of their time. I like to call Facebook kind of the water cooler of the digital world, because this is where people go to have conversation.
Right. And to catch up on, to find out what's going on.
Mhm.
I apologize. There's a lawnmower outside here, but I hope it's all right. Um, so let's take, if you're, I'd like to begin by, it's a general idea of the use of digital tools, that they should be a normal, natural part. But then what are some of the ways that you see using it, particularly in the church, in your work? Give some examples, and then also we'll talk about the dangers,
Mhm.
and the pitfalls, and also to bring in later the whole importance of keeping face-to-face communications as well as the digital social media.
So
So if you give us some examples, David.
yeah, I think of kind of the social media approach of a church in kind of two prongs, kind of the public face and the parish face in a way. And so what we did at Trinity is when I started at Trinity as the associate, is we immediately began to kind of create and develop a number of private groups for our members to interact and get information that were private. And so these are groups that are for, you hate to say members only because you don't think of it that way, but it gives a certain amount of privacy. It gives a certain amount of confidence that when you're communicating in that way,
And you're talking online communication, correct?
Right. So these are Facebook groups. So that, we have our Trinity Parish
Right.
Events group. We've got our children's ministry group, our youth ministry group, our parents in conversation group. And what's great about these groups is oftentimes people get direct notifications when you post in them. So it's a great way to reach in and communicate.
Can you give an example of one? I like for example, the parents in conversation.
Yeah, so and that group actually predated my existence. So they had already kind of organized into this Facebook group as a way to communicate things that were coming up that they were going to talk about, questions that they had. When we had to move all of our formation online in the midst of the pandemic, I just sent out a poll in our Parents in Conversation Facebook group to get a general sense of when people thought they would be available.
Interesting.
And so, so a number of the staff and I, we monitor these groups to make sure we kind of admit people in who want to be, who are members of our parish. And so it feels to me more like, especially now that we're all physically separated, it feels more like to me, almost kind of a quasi coffee hour space in a way, which is nice. On the other hand, you've got kind of the more public space, and that's our Facebook page. And that's, in a lot of ways, that's our digital front door for people. Nowadays, people will actually go to your Facebook page to find out who you are first, and then they'll go to your website. So it's really important to kind of continuously keep that page updated with interesting items, with things that are coming up, this formation series and all the other things that we're doing.
And I would add, you're using the word formation, but I think for a lot of the audience here, they may not know what we mean by formation. Means
education, religious education. Yeah, religious education opportunities. Yep.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And so, Facebook is probably the largest share of social media. So we invest a lot of our time in Facebook, but we also do Instagram. We technically have a Twitter account, but Twitter's a whole different beast, as you know. And also YouTube. Like YouTube is very much kind of a social medium as well. It's just primarily video. YouTube's owned by Google. So now when you Google something and you're searching, Google is throwing up YouTube links as well. And so it's also a chance for us as a church to be able to reach out, not just to our own people, but more broadly into the community.
So, and how would you differentiate these? Like you mentioned that the church uses Instagram. What are the cases for that? And then why not Twitter? You mentioned,
But Twitter, so I'll tackle Twitter first. Twitter, to really get a lot out of Twitter, you got to use it a lot, and you got to have a lot of interaction. The same goes for Facebook and Instagram, but Twitter seems to be more of an immediate kind of algorithm where you have to be using frequently and posting a lot. I think of social media as kind of a real life video game. And so the way social media works is that you post something, whether on Facebook or Twitter, Instagram, the more people interact with that post, if they like it, if they comment on it, if they share it, tells Facebook that this is engaging content. And what Facebook or any social media platform wants to do is to take all of your time. They want all of your free time. And so if you have an engaging post, their algorithm is going to say, this will take people's time and will engage people. And they're going to start presenting that to more people. And so like just an incredibly simple way to participate in the church's mission and evangelism of getting the message of Christ out is to comment on Trinity's Facebook post, or like them, or share them, invite your friends. Any kind of interaction on the public Facebook page for Trinity will then bump that up into people's feeds, so more and more people will see it. I mean, it is very much like a video game in that regard. Twitter is a hyper immediate kind of medium and platform where people are tweeting in real time as things happen. So you'll see people live tweeting a lot of things. So it takes a lot more time and resources to do Twitter really, really, really well.
Right. And what about, and you mentioned about the way that the church is using Facebook. What about Instagram? What are ways of that?
Yeah, Instagram tends to be, it's a completely visual kind of platform. It focuses on your images. You can't even put a link in your individual Instagram post. So it's designed to keep you on the platform scrolling through pictures. So Instagram, we tend to just post photos of things going on at the church. And one of the great things about Twitter, one of the great things about Instagram is your younger demographics tend to spend a lot more time on Instagram than on Facebook. So it's a different market share. So you tend to kind of at least try to have a different persona on Instagram that's a little bit more light and breezy. So this past Sunday, I posted a picture of myself in my mask before in the altar rather than our traditional images, because it's a little bit more lighthearted. It's a little more conversational, if you will.
Yeah. And the other thing you mentioned, an age difference in liking one thing and another. What about when the church, which has a congregation of people from, near death, 100 years old, or babies just being born, little children. So how do you work when you start thinking of an overall plan of how, if you have one, okay, this will aim more. And then how do you help the really older people who may not feel comfortable? That's an issue, I think.
So in the past, this was a while ago at my last parish where I was an associate as well. I actually taught classes, like social media 101 classes for folks.
Oh, really?
To walk them through the basics of how to log in, how to create your profile, why that's important, what to look out for. And then the other piece of that is also what to beware of, to have a sense of real social media literacy about trusted sources and how to engage in kind of some light media critique about kind of the reliableness of the information. And what I found was that people were really hungry for that because their grandkids were on that, their kids were on that, their great grandkids were on that, and it gave them a way to kind of connect with them in their own space. So it was a lot of fun. And so what I did with that group and then with the entire church, you can sometimes find quirks in the way a platform is set up. And at that time, this was many years ago, if you had a whole bunch of people change their profile pictures to the same image, it would group them all together and fill somebody's feed and people would begin to notice. So I created a little image for everybody in the parish that was the same image and had everybody update their profile pictures, and then suddenly had people in the town talking about this image that all of these crazy Episcopalians had put up. So
that was very clever.
Yeah, you can find little quirks in the way social media works and kind of exploit it as a way to get your message out.
Yeah. So what about now at Trinity? I mean, we haven't even mentioned we've mentioned YouTube, but we've also mentioned that we're having many of our meetings on Zoom like this.
Right. And so, this is kind of a different way to engage in the digital world together. And it's not public like on social media. It's more private, but it requires a certain amount of kind of technological baseline from internet connection to hardware and equipment. And what you find in a lot of churches, particularly in your more rural areas, we're so blessed and lucky to live in a city like Asheville. Because if you get out into some of the more remote areas of the country and in the nation, internet connections are really not nearly as fast to support kind of video conferencing. And so there's a real disparity right now in our country about who has access and how good is that access, which kind of, we could go on that for hours and hours and hours. So for us as a church, Trinity in its wisdom invested in technology early on. And so when we had to make that switch to live streaming our worship services, we already had a lot of equipment already installed that could be easily adapted. So it made that transition really, really smooth, because Scott and the vestry in their wisdom made those decisions early on. Not in preparation.
Talk a little about the process of our live streaming, because people, they see it, but they don't know what all went behind this. As you said, we were at least prepared.
Scott and I worked really hard those first couple of weeks to figure out what in the world we were doing, because they should. This
was at the beginning of the pandemic, when the recognition was that we couldn't be having regular church services. So then sort of walk through that process and then what you had to do.
Right. So already we knew that we had the cameras installed in the church.
You did.
So it was a matter, and we were lucky enough to have hosted the presiding bishop a year or so beforehand. Right. So I had walked through with the diocesan office and our audio tech specialist that we kind of work with. I'd already walked through how to live stream with him. So I had a general sense. So it was about refreshing my memory, getting some quick equipment to translate that into the live stream, and then just kind of doing test runs until we figured it out. It was a lot of trial and error.
And what about the camera? I still see, for example, the camera is still limited in it's not a wide shot, for example. I mean, I was in TV, so I know about wide shots and long shots.
So we've got one camera in the nave, and it's in the back of the church. It's an HD camera, but as you know, technology kind of changes over the years. So when this was installed, it was very much the top of the line kind of thing. And it works for us right now. So we can zoom in on from that one camera, we can zoom in onto the pulpit, onto the altar, and into the chancel. We kind of removed the big wide shot with the pews when we changed to the Celtic service, so we could have a better Celtic view of the
That's the evening service.
Yeah, that's the evening service. And right now, the thing about digital things, you can always improve, you can always adjust, and we're taking those next steps. So the first next step we did was to stream to YouTube, and then the next step was to stream simultaneously to YouTube and to Facebook, and then the next step was to figure out how to drop in an extra video from a different source in the middle of a live stream. And now we're kind of looking at what do we need to take that live stream experience for our parishioners and make it feel more like they're there and they're present, particularly if this kind of lasts a little bit longer. I think Scott and I both said that streaming has done so much for the church and connected us in ways, especially those who aren't able to attend, those who have moved away but still consider Trinity. I mean, can you imagine if you as a diplomat or as a journalist serving overseas could have still tuned in and worshiped along?
I would have loved it. Yeah.
Seeing your mom there in the pews. Yeah. I mean, what a way to be able to connect. So Scott and I have talked about, streaming's not going away. This is going to be part of our life from here on out, even when we're all able to gather again. Yeah. This is part of our life.
Well, and I think that, and I think it would be interesting to the audience to know where we, members of the vestry and with the clergy, are thinking ahead to when we might have what you might call hybrid services, with some people there, but not, because with social distancing spacing. And so therefore you're going to need wider shot cameras. Right. And then the question always is, like, who's controlling the camera? I mean, is there one person?
That's Sharon. Sharon's our great multitasking camera operator. We've got four.
She's our organist and music director.
We've got 4 preset views that she transitions between. And I actually set up and I run the live streams every Sunday, whether I'm there or not. I have remote access to the live streaming computer that is there in the chancel. So Scott and I are not present together to make sure that if one of us were to be sick, the other one wouldn't have to quarantine for the next 2 weeks.
Right.
So when he's preaching and celebrating, I'm actually at home running the streams from home because I just log into the computer from my home and run the streams. It's great.
Well, I think that, I mean, of course, to you, it's very natural, David, but I think to all of us, and especially the audience, I mean, to know this kind of inside information is fascinating. But, you know, then the question is, jumping back, you as a priest, is, you know, how do you prevent yourself being so engaged in the technology away from the question of the messaging and your goals of, you know, so talk a little about what goes through your mind.
So,
to tell yourself, don't be so bogged down in the technology.
So I continue to be a priest in all the traditional ways. It's definitely true. But, you know, in the Episcopal Church and in some denominations, they have digital missioners, and their primary kind of goal is to find ways to do digital formation, ways to do engaging in digital life. I think it's really important for the church to be present digitally, because that is where a large number of people spend a significant portion of their free time.
Right.
And it's not a criticism. It's just kind of an objective fact. And I think it's very important for the church to be proclaiming the gospel in those spaces as well. So I think of God has always been about reaching out and communicating to us. And so that's what the church's job is to do, is to reach out and to communicate to the world and to communicate that message of peace and love and mercy and justice. And the more we can do that in a variety of different ways, the better. I mean, the church has always done this. They've always used the new technology, you know, from the printing press to Martin Luther co-opting bar songs to turn them into hymns. I mean, some of the Martin Luther hymns that we sing and that the Lutheran Church sings, if you were singing them back in his day, you would have gone, isn't that the song they sing down the pub? And so, you know, for us, it's about taking the communication tools that we have and using them in service of our mission as both Christians and as Trinity Church.
Yeah, that's excellent. And let's go, you and I have also discussed this sort of before we conclude. You've mentioned about how the digital tools also provide a way to find out more, to help people more, to learn, you know, reactions. It's not just the speaker, it's always a two-way street. And so talk about digital tools and how this provides that when you're not face to face.
I'm really glad you kind of mentioned that, because, you know, when you talk about diplomacy, and in our first conversation, you know, a big part of diplomacy is listening to the person you're dialoguing with.
Right.
And so it's really easy to monologue on social media, and it's really easy to get within your own echo chamber on social media. So I can curate what I see on social media so it only fits with my own personal bias, for lack of a better way to put it. But if we use social media intentionally, it can very much help us to listen more broadly to different voices, and voices that otherwise we never hear or never really have access to. The great thing about social media is that it does give a platform. It kind of democratizes the platform. A lot of the traditional tools of diplomacy require a certain amount of access. I've got to have a stage on which to give my speech. I've got to know some journalists to get my name and my perspective in the newspaper. To get invited to that conference, I've got to have some connections, resources, or awareness. Whereas on social media, anybody with an internet connection can have a voice and have that potential. And so it gives us a chance to listen to a much more diverse group of people than we normally would. And a lot of kind of the social movements and activism that you see in our world today, I don't think would actually exist without social media, because they've used social media to get that message out in a way that that normally wouldn't. You know, I mean, and a great example of this is actually the Black Lives Matter movement. This was started by 3 women of color who identify as queer, And in civil rights movements, traditionally male ministers have been centered. But yet these three women have started one of the, an incredibly powerful social movement out of this hashtag that started on a Facebook post back in 2013.
Wow.
And, and so now you've got a NASCAR with Black Lives Matter. You got a NASCAR car with Black Lives Matter on it. So to see, regardless of how people feel about the movement itself, to see a group of people who would typically not have a voice in traditional channels use social media to have a really powerful voice is a real testament to what the potential of social media is for public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy.
Right. And as you know, I've mentioned other movements that started.
Exactly.
And, you mentioned hashtags. I mean, if you put a hashtag with a word or two or phrase, you are starting the seed of a movement because you're focusing on that hashtag.
And I'm old enough to remember when a hashtag was the pound sign.
Right, exactly.
But a hashtag is a way that people connected, and that's what these movements have done, is they've been able to organize quickly and broadly, and do a lot of work. I mean, one of the crazy things is how you can use social media to get that message out and to kind of change perceptions and opinions. I mean, just take our case study of Black Lives Matter. You can see Pew did this survey back in 2016 and then repeated it in 2020. And look at that just remarkable sea change almost of people's perceptions of the Black Lives Matter movement. It doesn't happen overnight, but consistent use of social media in this way really did change perceptions and opinions. And so it's just that continual work of getting that message out there. And so sometimes it may not feel like we're getting our message out, right, because we're not going viral and we're not having millions of people watch our stuff, but it's that steady accumulation of being present and continuing to share that message over and over and over again for us as Christians of God's love and justice and mercy and peace in the world. And eventually that message begins to seep into those channels. And so as a church, share our videos, share our sermons, share our worship, invite your friends to view with you. You can do watch parties on Facebook. There's so many wonderful tools that even when we are staying at home, we can still have this really powerful voice in the world to proclaim the kingdom of God, which is amazing and wonderful. That in spite of everything, we can still do this mission, even if we're in our recliners at home. Right.
Well, and before we conclude, I just wanted to ask, because I'll go back to, we talked last week with Scott about his sermons.
Yes.
And you were also a fabulous speaker and
thank you.
Right. I love your sermons. But what do you think about when you're writing your sermons and of their being put out digitally? So tie it in with the digital tools.
So that's an interesting question. I'm actually still working through that because this is a very new experience for us to know that for me, preaching is I'm preaching to the congregation. I'm preaching to my people.
And Scott emphasized that it's the parish and the congregation.
And so I'm preaching to my people who I have a relationship with, who have a relationship with me. If I have an off Sunday and I kind of preach a dud, I have enough of a relationship with people that people will say, well, we love him anyway, I hope. But, when you're putting your sermons out into the broader world and the potential for everybody to see them, frankly, it adds a little bit, a layer of anxiety because it's a completely different audience. And in a way, I've just had to kind of say to myself at this point that my audience, the purpose of preaching right now is still for our people and for our parish and for our community, and encouraging our people in our parish to be better disciples, more faithful disciples, and to me as well, to be a better and more faithful disciple.
Right.
As any preacher will tell you, half the times what you're saying in a sermon is what you also need to hear as well.
Well, that goes to, of course, and it gets us back to sort of, when you talk about mass communications or the mass media, it's really ultimately shouldn't be different from a face-to-face speech. in which you have to care who your audience is in order to craft your message.
Right.
And that's what I think. So I think it's very important, maybe if you could just sort of summarize this and talk about, in conclusion, about the role of digital technology, and yet the continuing importance of the face-to-face, so that we don't lose that either.
Oh, digital will never completely replace interpersonal relationships. I mean, even this Zoom conference, this Zoom call that we're on, where we're face-to-face, is an impaired form of interpersonal communication. Right. You can't read body language. You can't read presence. You know, when I'm preaching a sermon, one of the big revelations and reminders with an empty church is that I rely on our parish and the people in our parish to preach. There is a give and take that's often unspoken and nonverbal that is really important, that it is a shared moment. And so I've deeply missed that part of preaching, not having that preaching moment being an immediate shared kind of moment where we are engaging with one another as people. It's really hard to make people laugh when they're not present. And I think there's something divine about humor, and there's a connectedness that happens when you preach a sermon in person that is irreplaceable. There's irreplaceable. I can preach the most beautiful and erudite sermon possible, but there's something missing if I'm not preaching it in the presence of somebody. So it's great that we have these tools. Wonderful that we have these tools. But I don't ever want anybody to think that these tools are going to replace being able to sit down with a cup of coffee with you, Liz, in your living room and talk about faith and life. That's just completely different. So use these tools, but know their limits. Embrace these tools and know their pitfalls, just like all our other tools that we have.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful, David. And thank you so much. And if you would just maybe just say a few words in concluding this series that we've had.
Well, so thank you so much, Liz. I mean, from the bottom of my heart, when you pitched this series to us, I got so excited to get to talk about social media. I got so excited to get to hear my boss talk about preaching so I could get some pointers, which is great. And also this idea that as a church, we are diplomats in the world, ambassadors, as you said, and we are God's spokespeople in so many ways in this world. So thank you for giving us some insight and from your expertise and your wisdom to help us go out into the world as a church and as individuals to be ambassadors for Christ's love and reconciliation and mercy in the world, because God knows we need it.
Thank you. Thank you.